This is the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 319. On the 24th of October 2022, a Singaporean 777 was on the ground at London Heathrow International Airport getting ready for the long flight to Singapore's Changi Airport. While they were on the ground, they got the terminal aerodrome forecast, the TAF, that told them to expect some moderate thunderstorms on the way in. The thunderstorms were only expected to last about 30 minutes to about an hour, so with everything looking good, they decided to take off. And then, a couple of hours later, they were in the Kuala Lumpur Flight Information Region. The Singapore Approach Control, or the SAC, let them know that they could expect runway 20 right to land at Changi. While they were making their way towards Changi, they were asked to hold over the waypoint PASPU, as runway 20 right had a bit of a tailwind making landings hard. A minute into their hold, ATC let them know that they might be waiting a while as the tailwind had intensified to about 10 knots. By this time, the pilots had started to look at alternate airports. The first and second alternate airports, Paya Lebar Air Base and Senai International Airport, were engulfed by rain as well. Their third alternate, Batam Airport in Indonesia, was a viable option. But as they mulled a diversion, ATC let them know that the active runway had now switched to 02 left. But Changi Airport was still engulfed by rain, and as the pilots lined the jet up with the runway, the visibility dropped to about 2 nautical miles. As time went on, the visibility dropped further. In the control tower, the controllers did not like what their displays were telling them. The wind was changing rapidly. The tower had just changed the traffic flow from runway 20 to runway 02, and now the wind had changed again, making arrivals into runway 20 left and right much harder. As they looked over the data, 2 planes aborted their approach to runway 02 left, and a third plane just decided not to go forward with the landing at all as the weather was just that bad. Thus, the controllers decided to stop arrivals into the airport for the time being and let the pilots know that they could expect a longer delay. The pilots were asked to hold over the waypoint SAMKO. The pilots were now getting worried. They let ATC know that they could only hold over SAMKO for one circuit and then they'd be at bingo fuel. From that point on, they would be flying on their emergency fuel reserves. So they listened to the transmissions from Batam Airport and it looked like things were good all the way over there. Then they got the bad news. The weather at Batam had started to get worse. The visibility was now under 500 meters. The crew now seriously considered the prospect of diverting to Batam Airport before the weather got any worse. As the 777 held over SAMKO, the pilots let the controllers know that they could perform one more hold, and if the weather did not improve and they did not get a quick landing clearance, then they would need to divert to Batam. At this point though, the pilots aren't too worried. Both Changi and Batam are about the same distance from the plane right now, and they should have no issues getting the plane to either airport. Meanwhile, the controllers on the ground worked with the controllers at Batam to make the diversion happen. The pilots were now coming up to the end of the second hold. They needed to know what to do from the controllers, as they could not hold for any longer. They had squeezed as much performance as they could from their 777, but now they needed to get this jet on the ground and fast. But to their dismay, and maybe even shock, ATC asked them to fly south. This was away from both Changi and Batam airports and made no sense. The pilots were confused. ATC explained that Changi wasn't ready for any new arrivals yet, and their diversion to Batam had not been approved yet. The pilots were kind of uneasy about this. They did not want to fly south, so they asked if they could perform one more hold over SAMKO, which approach control was okay with. Now, the crew was getting desperate. They needed to land now. So, ATC started vectoring the plane towards Batam, even though the final approval for the diversion had not come in yet. But hey, if they were desperate, this is what they had to do. The jet was handed off to the SAC, who then handed the plane off to the TPAC. Then, the plane made its way all the way to Batam, and the pilots declared mayday fuel. From this point, if they landed straight into Batam, then they would be able to land with the final reserve fuel. The final reserve fuel is the minimum permissible amount of fuel that they were legally allowed to land with. But yet, the clearance for the diversion still had not come in yet. Eventually, the clearance came in and the pilots lined the jet up with the runway. They were almost home, almost being the operative word here. But as they were on short final to runway 22 at Batam, they were informed that they had a 14-knot tailwind, gusting to 30 knots. This landing could not be carried out, and they went around at 1,600 feet. The pilots asked the controllers to immediately set them up for a landing on runway 04, the reciprocal runway. Right after the go-around, the pilots maneuvered the plane to avoid some weather. After a little bit of maneuvering, they had runway 04 in sight. Approach control handed the plane off to the tower, and Flight 319 read everything back correctly. In the cockpit, the pilots wrestled with the controls to get the plane on the right path to capture the ILS to perform an auto land. But the tower still had not heard from the plane. They could not clear them to land if the plane didn't contact them. In the cockpit at this time, the pilots had wrangled the plane into a position where they could successfully capture the signals of the ILS system on the ground. And confident that the plane would now do the rest and land on autopilot, the pilot hit the autopilot button at 688 feet. But to his surprise, the warning sign, no auto land, lit up on the screens. The diamonds that are used to show the deviation of the plane from the optimal path were fully deflected to one side, meaning that this plane was nowhere near the correct glide path. So the pilots went around again. Keep in mind, they started burning through their emergency fuel a while back, and each go-around consumed a ton of fuel. Meanwhile, in the tower, the controllers are confused. They're expecting a 777 to contact them at like any second, but they can hear someone going around. So they contact approach control, and they're like, hey, someone's going around. Who is it? Meanwhile, the pilots are still in contact with the approach control, and they told them that they were going around instead of the tower. Right after this go-around, the pilot started setting the plane up for a landing on runway 04. He inquired about the state of the winds for runway 22. It was bad news. The visibility was down to 500 meters, and the wind was at 7 knots. Also, they were still not in contact with the tower at this point. All of these requests were being relayed to the tower through approach control, and that meant that it took up to 90 seconds for the pilots to get this critical information. With their fuel state, they could not afford to waste any more time. The pilots let approach control know that they would land on runway 04. Quote, it had to be successful. With that, the pilots lined the jet up for another go. A little bit of good news for the pilots finally came through. The weather had improved a bit, and visibility was now 800 meters. Sensing how dire their situation was, approach control and Batam Tower now started to clear out all the planes in the vicinity of the airport to give Flight 319 a clear berth to come in and land. The jet broke through the cloud cover, and things were not right. The aircraft was above the center line and offset to the left, but they had to make this landing work no matter what. The pilots pushed the nose down, and the jet picked up some serious speed. The descent rate hit 1,400 feet per minute, and the GPWS, or ground proximity warning system, sent out a couple of terrain warnings. The pilots now had to go around again, this time just 212 feet off the ground, because this landing was not salvageable. They were now truly desperate. There was no time to reposition the jet, circle the airport, and set up for another landing. The pilot just threw the plane into a turn, flew a 180, and headed right back for the airport. This would be a visual landing. No ILS, no automation, just the pilot bringing the jet in. Approach control now had some bad news for the jet that was about to land. Runway 22 now had a 15-knot wind from 330 degrees. This was a problem as per Singapore Airlines' procedure. The tailwind component for a landing had to be below 10 knots. Moreover, the 777's limit was 15 knots. But they had no other choice. It was either land now or crash into the sea off of Indonesia. The pilot made the turn, lined the jet up, and brought the plane in, hoping that the engines would hold out long enough till they reached the safety of the airport. As the storm battered the jet, the pilots prayed that this landing would work, and it did. As the main gear touched down on runway 22 at Batam Airport, the pilots and the passengers breathed a sigh of relief. According to Av Herald, at the point of engine shutdown, the plane had 400 kilos of fuel on board. For context, 5 minutes of single-engine taxiing burns about 65 kilos of fuel, and that's just with one engine. This amount of fuel would not have been enough for a go-around, much less another attempt. This jet got way too close to crashing, and I don't think the people on board knew how close they were to disaster. So, how did all of this happen? How did an intercontinental passenger jet come down to the last few drops of fuel, risking all the lives on board? The thing is that deciding to divert is more of an art and less of a science. Really, the only rule that they have to follow is that they have to land with more than the final reserve amount of fuel. If you're above that, you're good. But that being said, pilots are strongly incentivized to land at their original destination. Otherwise, you're going to have a bunch of grumpy passengers who might need hotels and another flight back. So if you don't know when your primary airport might reopen, you might need to weigh your options and decide what to do. And for obvious reasons, there is no one-size-fits-all solution here. From the actions of the crew, it is clear that they wanted to make the landing at Changi work. When they were holding over SAMKO, they did multiple orbits when they said that they could only do one orbit. Moreover, they were still asking about the status of Changi when they decided to divert. As they waited for Changi to reopen, they were eating into their safety margin for the landing at Batam. If something went wrong on that landing, then that would leave them in a very hard spot. But unknown to the pilots of Flight 319, as they waited, the weather did not. The weather system that was making life so hard for them right now was moving in the direction of Batam Airport, and by the time that they got there, the weather system was waiting for them. Then, when they did get there, the pilots made a terrible mistake. You see, for the first landing, the pilots were trying what's known as an auto land, i.e. the plane lands itself. In most cases, if the infrastructure is there, and more often than not, most large airports have ILS systems, and the airport at Batam did, the problem is that the ILS localizer was offset from the runway heading at Batam by 1 degree. This meant that the autoland system would just fail to activate because obviously the runway is not lined up with the localizer. The thing is, the no autoland signal threw the crew off of their game, and hard. The pilots were flustered by what they saw, and that message threw a wrench into the works. If they had known to expect a no autoland error, then they could have used the ILS to get down to the decision height and then land the plane visually. But since they were so unprepared for this, they had to go around. To be fair, there was no explicit warning on the charts that said that an autoland should not be attempted. You basically had to look at the runway and then look at the localizer heading and then be like, oh wait, these don't match. I can't do an autoland here. In the case of the Phuket airport, which also has a misaligned localizer, they make it very clear that an autoland should not be attempted here. That was not the case for Batam. Moreover, Singapore Area Control and the pilots themselves were treating the situation very differently. Even though the pilots declared that they were at their minimum fuel, the controllers in the SAC did not treat it as an emergency, but the pilots were. That's why they asked Flight 319 to head south, at one point taking them away from both airports. Both parties were not on the same page. All of these factors set the pilots up for a difficult landing in some of the worst weather in the region. Speaking of the weather, this is the first report that I've ever read where they've named climate change as a reason. Climate change has made storms like the one that Flight 319 encountered more common than ever and even more intense, meaning that more and more pilots in the coming years are going to be operating in situations like this. Here's a quote. This may likely result in pilots operating into areas where the weather conditions exceed the limits to conduct a safe landing or results in loss of capacity of an airport that may impact the regional airspace system. The effects of climate change are also expected to make the operating environment for pilots more unpredictable. End quote. That's the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 319. If you want to listen to another story that's very similar to this, I'll put up a Jet Airways video on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.